The Kākāpō looks like a contradiction. It is a parrot, but it cannot fly. It is large and heavy, yet active mostly at night. It has bright green plumage, but it relies on stillness and camouflage rather than speed. Endemic to New Zealand, the Kākāpō evolved in an isolated ecological theater where the normal rules of survival were different from most of the world. Today it is critically endangered, with a tiny managed population, and every living individual is known to conservation teams. That level of monitoring tells you how close the species came to disappearing. But the Kākāpō is not just a tragic near-loss. It is also one of the clearest examples of how evolution can produce highly specialized success in one environment and extreme vulnerability in another. To understand why this bird is so unusual, and why saving it is so complex, we need to start with the world that shaped it. New Zealand's long isolation created a biological experiment unlike continents dominated by land mammals. In many regions, small and medium mammals occupy key roles as ground foragers, seed predators, and night-active omnivores. In ancient New Zealand, birds filled many of those spaces. For the Kākāpō's ancestors, the absence of fast terrestrial mammalian predators reduced the value of sustained powered flight. Over deep time, natural selection favored energy strategies that made sense in relatively stable, resource-variable forests, stronger bodies, lower metabolic demands, and less investment in large flight musculature. What sounds like a loss, flightlessness, was once an adaptation. The Kākāpō did not become incomplete, it became optimized for a mammal-light island system. Its modern fragility is therefore not evidence that it evolved poorly. It is evidence that environments can change faster than evolutionary rescue can occur, especially when humans introduce entirely new predator guilds. Physically, the Kākāpō is built for a ground-based life. Adults can reach about 64 centimeters in length, and males are typically much heavier than females, often around 1.5 to 3 kilograms compared with roughly 1 to 1.5 kilograms for females. That strong size difference is part of the species' visible sexual dimorphism. The bird's plumage is a mottled yellow-green with darker patterning, ideal for blending into native vegetation. It has a large gray beak suited for processing fibrous plant foods, short legs, strong feet, and relatively short wings and tail. Internally, reduced wing and shoulder musculature and a smaller keel on the sternum reflect the shift away from flight. One of its most iconic features is the facial disc around forward-facing eyes, giving it an owl-like expression and helping explain the nickname owl parrot. Together, these traits form an integrated design: stealth, climbing, browsing, and nocturnal navigation rather than aerial escape. Behaviorally, the species is even more distinctive. The Kākāpō is nocturnal and herbivorous, foraging on leaves, shoots, fruits, and other plant material as availability changes by season. Its low basal metabolic rate helps conserve energy, which is useful for an animal that can face fluctuating food quality and does not rely on high-speed movement. But the most unusual feature is reproductive strategy. The Kākāpō is the only parrot known to use a polygynous lek system. Males gather and compete through display and calling, females visit to choose mates, and then females handle chick rearing alone. There is no male parental care. That system can function in stable conditions, but for a critically endangered species it introduces bottlenecks. Breeding output depends on female condition, timing, ecological cues, and mate availability all aligning. When numbers are very low, a single poor breeding season can have outsized consequences. Recovery therefore requires not just protecting adults, but engineering conditions where enough successful nesting can happen repeatedly. The Kākāpō also sits within a long human history. Maori communities knew the species well, and the bird appears in Maori cultural knowledge and tradition. Historically, it was hunted for meat and valued for feathers. That context matters because conservation stories often flatten history into simple categories of villain and savior. Real histories are layered. People can have practical, symbolic, and spiritual relationships with the same species across different periods. The severe collapse of Kākāpō populations did not arise from one isolated act, but from accumulating pressures over time, then accelerating under ecological disruption brought by introduced mammals. Acknowledging indigenous history and later colonial-era environmental change gives a more accurate picture of how decline happened. It also reminds us that restoration is not only biological management. It is cultural responsibility across generations, including decisions about what kind of ecological inheritance a society chooses to preserve. The collapse phase became catastrophic after the arrival of mammalian predators such as cats, rats, stoats, and ferrets. The Kākāpō's anti-predator toolkit, freeze behavior, camouflage, nocturnal movement, and ground living, had evolved against different threats. Mammals that hunt by scent and patrol the forest floor turned those once effective traits into liabilities. Flightless adults were vulnerable, nests and chicks were even more exposed. Because the species reproduces slowly and irregularly, mortality quickly outpaced recruitment. Habitat pressures compounded the problem, and by the late 20th century the population had fallen so low that stochastic events alone could have finished it. At that point, conservation moved from broad habitat concern to species-level emergency operations. Every bird became important at individual scale. When a population is this small, statistics are no longer abstract. The survival or death of one breeding female can influence the trajectory of the entire species for years. Early efforts were fragmented and often insufficient for the scale of risk. The major strategic shift came with the Kākāpō recovery program launched in 1995, which embraced intensive, coordinated intervention. Birds were translocated to predator-free islands, where baseline survival improved dramatically. Management became proactive, regular health monitoring, nest surveillance, breeding support, data tracking, and rapid response to threats. In effect, conservationists created controlled ecological refuges to buy time for population growth. This approach can seem highly managed compared with romantic ideas of untouched wilderness, but for ultra-rare species it is often the only realistic bridge between near extinction and recovery. The program also showed that technical consistency matters more than sporadic enthusiasm. Long-term gains required year-after-year execution, not one-off rescue moments. The Kākāpō's persistence to this point is less a miracle than the cumulative result of disciplined operations sustained across decades. Even with modern management, the species remains in a precarious zone. The known population, around 235 individuals in 2026, is encouraging compared with historic lows but still critically small. At this scale, genetic constraints become central. Limited diversity can increase vulnerability to disease, reduce reproductive robustness, and narrow adaptive capacity over time. Conservation therefore must balance short-term population growth with long-term genetic health, deciding which individuals breed, monitoring lineage representation, and minimizing inbreeding risk. Add the species' unusual life history, long lifespan, irregular breeding patterns, and female-only parental care, and recovery becomes biologically and logistically demanding. Success is not measured by a single good year, it is measured by sustained positive trends across multiple generations. That requires reliable funding, specialized expertise, and continuity of institutional memory. In practical terms, the Kākāpō remains a species that survives because people actively maintain the conditions in which it can reproduce and persist. A notable recent milestone was reintroduction to mainland New Zealand at Sanctuary Mountain Maungatatori in 2023. Symbolically, this is powerful. The species is no longer confined only to emergency island strongholds. Strategically, it diversifies risk and tests whether robust predator control can support broader restoration. But mainland return is not a final victory lap. It is a high-maintenance phase requiring fences, surveillance, biosecurity discipline, and fast intervention when threats appear. Reintroduction success depends less on the release event itself and more on what happens in the following months and years. If predator pressure resurges, fragile gains can reverse quickly. Still, each successful mainland step expands future options and reconnects public identity with native species once thought functionally absent from those landscapes. That social dimension matters because long-term conservation needs civic legitimacy, not just scientific correctness. People protect what they recognize as part of their living environment. The Kākāpō's trajectory carries a wider lesson for global biodiversity policy. Many endangered species are trapped by the same pattern: evolved specialization, rapid human-driven change, invasive species pressure, and delayed intervention. By the time action begins, populations are often so low that passive protection is no longer enough. The Kākāpō demonstrates that intensive management can work, but also that it is expensive, technical, and fragile. This raises uncomfortable but necessary questions. Which species receive full-scale rescue? How do we prioritize limited resources? How do we prevent future crises so fewer species reach emergency status? The bird story is therefore both hopeful and cautionary. Hopeful because coordinated science can reverse trajectories that once looked irreversible. Cautionary because the rescue burden grows dramatically when ecosystems are allowed to degrade first and repaired later. Prevention remains cheaper, simpler, and more humane than last-minute salvation. What makes the Kākāpō especially compelling is that it reframes rarity as responsibility rather than curiosity. This is not merely a strange bird to admire from a distance. It is a living remnant of an evolutionary pathway that exists nowhere else. If it disappears, we do not lose only one species, we lose unique behavior, unique physiology, and unique ecological memory accumulated over millions of years. The current recovery proves extinction is not always inevitable, but it also shows how thin the margin can be. The future of the Kākāpō depends on persistent predator control, careful breeding management, habitat stewardship, and public commitment that outlasts media attention. In that sense, the species has become a test of consistency. Can humans sustain long-horizon care after the dramatic crisis moment passes? If the answer stays yes, the Kākāpō's next century may be defined not by near erasure, but by deliberate recovery. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.